Hey, welcome to a new video. I'm planning to keep this one pretty short, just because of some of the events of the last about week and a half to nearing 2 weeks here. I was really sick last week, and so I'm still kind of in a recovery mode, but more so my mother passed away almost 2 weeks ago now, and so we are, there's a lot of family mourning, and kind of in an adjustment phase, but that's not what I'm going to focus on. That's I might do a video just kind of, talking about the loss of parents, but what happened about 2 days after my mother died, another person who was, considerably less influential, but influential nonetheless in my childhood, Stan Lee passed away. And of course, Stan Lee, known for being, the face of Marvel most of my childhood. And he was, of course, often credited as the creator of Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and the Hulk and numerous other heroes, though usually he was more in a collaborator. Really, let's face it, he was primarily a collaborator. I mean, the whole Marvel method was usually something along the lines of he tossed out the basic idea, the artist drew it, it came back to him, he came up with dialogue to go with it, and they were done, and sometimes it was even less than that. And there was definitely some rough blood between him and creators like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, especially just because one of Stan's great talents was a promoter. He really was exceptionally good at that, and he could make everything seem exciting, and when you're a kid, that excitement is infectious. And I think one of the reasons I feel differently about him than, say, Bob Kane is that I don't think at any point his feeling was, how can I screw these guys over and get all the fame? I think he just loved promoting Marvel and obviously himself. And I'm pretty sure I've seen evidence that he had, in fact, he and Kirby had made amends towards the end of Kirby's life, and even Kirby's family had positive things to say. I wish Marvel would have been better with Kirby in the end of his life. Well, really, Marvel and DC, I wish they'd have really, reached out and made peace and restitution to him before he died, instead of everything having to be fought for by his family. But they acknowledged the impact that Stan had, and they weren't bitter about it. And which I think a lot of people would have understood if they had been had been a kind of icy cold about it. But it really, I don't think it's understating things to say that if you took any of those early creators of Stan or Jack or Steve, if you took any of them out, any one of them, we would not have the Marvel universe we have today. And if you took out Stan Lee, you wouldn't have the characters we know. Even though if you still had Jack Kirby creating them, they wouldn't quite be the same. And to me, that's really the legacy there of Stan, is his way with words and his way to inspire a kid and even adults with, kind of a punchy catchphrase. I mean, with great power comes great responsibility is a pretty great tagline. So, suffice to say, a lot of people have been impacted by Stan. Not not just kids, but even adults. I mean, my mom never read comic books. My mom knew who Stan Lee was. She could recognize Stan Lee. And a large part of that was she'd seen all the Marvel movies. And this, people were familiar. Everybody had heard of him, so to speak. I mean, there are people, obviously, who just, those kinds of movies fly under their radar. They don't read comics. They're not into any of that. And it's fine that people don't know who he is and aren't particularly impacted by his death. That's okay. I'm not being critical of those people as in any fashion. I think that's in and of itself. I get it. But a lot of the people I know who are like, Stan doesn't really mean a whole lot to me, were doing it in the fashion of, I still feel bad for my friends for whom he had an impact. I don't connect, but I understand losing someone who meant something to you artistically. And then there was Bill Maher. Bill Maher's always kind of had this little thing about, he's never really been fond of like superhero movies and stuff, and he's been critical in the past. And who really cares? I'm not really that worried about that. But he did ruffle a lot of feathers with a blog from his real-time website in which he had a post called Adulting. And in this blog, he wrote, "The guy who created Spider-Man and the Hulk has died, and America is in mourning. Deep, deep mourning for a man who inspired millions to, I don't know, watch a movie, I guess." Someone on Reddit posted, "I'm so incredibly grateful I lived in a world that included Stan Lee. Personally, I'm grateful I live in a world that included oxygen and trees, but to each his own. Now, I have nothing against comic books. I read them now and then when I was a kid, and I was all out Hardy Boys. But the assumption that everyone had back then, both the adults and the kids, was that comics were for kids, and when you grew up, you moved on to big boy books without the pictures. But then 20 years or so ago, something happened. Adults decided they didn't have to give up kid stuff, and so they pretended comic books were actually sophisticated literature. And because America has over 4,500 colleges, which means we need more professors than we have smart people, some dumb people got to be professors by writing theses with titles like The Otherness and Heterodoxy in the Silver Surfer. And now when adults are forced to do grown-up things like buy auto insurance, they call it adulting and act like it's some giant struggle. I'm not saying we've necessarily gotten stupider. The average Joe is smarter in a lot of ways than he was in, say, the 1940s when a big night out was the Three Stooges short and a Carmen Miranda musical. The problem is we're using our smarts on stupid stuff. I don't think it's a huge stretch to suggest that Donald Trump could only get elected in a country that thinks comic books are important. Oh, Bill. Now, let's be upfront. This is really not Bill Maher's biggest infraction. It isn't. Frankly, he's just being rude and a bit of an asshole upon the death of a well-loved celebrity. And that's his right, that's his perspective. I'm not saying he can't have that opinion. I will say that I think his opinion is wrong. I don't think Stan Lee inspired people to simply go see some movies. As I noted earlier, I think he inspired a lot of people to have more noble values, like with great power comes great responsibility, that heroism comes from within. Bigotry is not a noble value or not something a heroic person would support. And all these things are there. And that's not to say you can't get those messages anywhere else. Certainly you can. But a lot of people still like to turn to those power fantasies to get some of their inspiration. And there's nothing wrong there. That's not bad. That's not wrong. And frankly, taking maturity advice from a guy who spent much of his adult life hanging out with Hugh Hefner and going to the Playboy Mansion parties, is kind of hilarious. You don't get much more delayed adolescence than Playboy. Now, after people started kind of coming down on Maher and criticizing this, there all of a sudden was this backlash of people going, oh, well, so this is the thing that pisses you off with Maher? This is your final straw? And I had a problem with that reaction as much as I had with Bill Maher's reaction. There's nothing wrong with being critical of what he said. It doesn't mean that this is the first thing you've ever found worthy of criticism from him. This simply is another thing for a lot of people. I've seen a lot of people who, when Bill Maher says something stupid, they notice it and they comment on it, whether it's whether they're just telling Maher to, go screw himself, or if they're going to offer a real hardcore condemnation, like they do when he says something racist, or against, something Islamophobic. It's actually possible to be critical of Maher for more than one thing, and being critical of one thing now doesn't mean you haven't been critical in the past. And there's no reason to assume for anybody that this is their first noticing that Bill Maher can be an asshole or an idiot. And Bill Maher moved into this weird, as much as he likes to paint himself as a real progressive, he moved into this bitter old man, get off my lawn kids mentality a long time ago. And this is just more of that. This is, again, not his worst infraction. The worst part of this particular moment is his insinuation that it's the comic book, being into superheroes and stuff, that somehow would allow for Donald Trump to be elected. But no. The real problem is not comic book fans or people who like superhero movies. These are not the people necessarily electing Donald Trump. It's the Islamophobic people. It's the people worried about the caravans, the racists. It's the people who hear the messages of the alt-right and buy into those fearfully. Bill Maher has done far more to normalize those things. This is a guy who had Jordan Peterson on his show and actually looked incredulous at the idea that people are critical of Peterson. He's like, these look like common sense ideas. Because Bill Maher only looks at a surface level of things. In spite of his admonition to read and learn, he never goes below the surface. He sees just enough to feed into his mentality and then makes his judgment based on that. Bill Maher is not a deep intellectual thinker. He's given a voice to people like Milo Yiannopoulos, Jordan Peterson, many alt-writers, and often with very, very little, he plays softball, even when he's being critical. His harshest words are going to be for comic fans and stuff like that, whatever. But the fact is Bill Maher has done far more to make it possible for guys like Donald Trump to get elected than comic books and superhero movies and all that. It's ridiculous. And it's okay to be bothered by that. It's okay to be critical and go on Twitter and make comments being critical of Bill Maher about this. Doesn't mean you weren't critical of other things, so people need to kind of step back and stop assuming that's the thing that broke Bill Maher for people. I'm not saying it didn't for some, but I certainly don't know many people for whom that was the first thing they noticed, where they're like, he's an idiot. So I'm choosing to ultimately look at this as, this is a minor Bill Maher moment. Bill Maher doesn't offer a lot of deep intellectual thought. I'm not going to worry myself too much about it. It's already at this point, kind of becoming a faded whatever memory. And so, in closing, I just want to go back to the fact that Stan Lee was one of those inspirational figures for me as a kid who really inspired my love for comics, both superheroes and eventually the discovery that there's a much bigger world outside of superheroes. And I'm just going to close out with saying, hey, certainly would appreciate a like, but if you have comments, whether you kind of disagree with me on some of this or disagree greatly, I don't know, you can put it in the comments. You can also reach me through the In One Ear blog or the Tripping Through Gateways blog, and I can be found on Twitter. That's at THOMWADE. And I will likely interact with you there. So have a great holiday weekend, and Excelsior! Enough said.